section 3 of Cold War social science, and today we're going to talk about non-alignment, and then the crisis in the Middle East, and then the New World Order coming about due to non-alignment and decolonization. So first off, we're going to start with the Bandung Conference in 1955, where we see 28 nations go to the Indonesian city of Bandung for what's called the Afro-Asian Conference, which has now been kind of colloquially called the Bandung Conference. This is in April of 1955. The key thing about this meeting is that the Soviets and the Americans are not invited, because what we see here is that they're calling the Bandung Conference is all about unifying the former colonized nations of not necessarily the Soviet Union and the United States, but certainly allies of the United States and areas that the Soviets would like to influence. The two kind of key leaders calling for non-alignment are India's Jawaharlal Nehru and Indonesia's Sukarno. And they advocated for a new political philosophy called non-alignment during this Cold War. So what non-alignment is a declaration of neutrality between the Soviets and the Americans. The countries that are not aligned can't join formal alliances, but they can maintain diplomatic ties with the two sides within the Cold War. But as we've seen with the United States tends to look at anything that's non-American leaning as communist. And so this really alarms the United States. But they might actually have good reason this time, because the premier of China is at this conference. And U.S. officials saw China's growing influence on these new states and independence movements as a threat to possibly seeing communism grow within Asia. And then they talked about the fate of 1.6 billion people hanging in the balance. I am assuming that they mean the countries in Asia at this point. I'm not exactly sure what that number is referencing, if it's the Chinese population at the time, which I don't think it was that high. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. And then what we see here, according to Secretary of State Dulles, John Foster Dulles, let me actually put that in there just to make sure we don't get him confused with his brother. He believes that if communism takes hold in the underdeveloped world, the ratio of capitalist to communist nations would flip. Basically, at this point, there's a 2-to-1 ratio of countries in favor of freedom. So 2 countries for every one that was communist. But he believes that if the underdeveloped nations were to switch to communism, then it would become 1 free nation for every 3 communist nations. Right. And so in the zero-sum thinking of American officials, non-alignment had to be checked. But the Bandung Conference is the first signal that the early Cold War era is kind of shifting into this new era where it's not just the Soviets versus the Americans. Right. It became a much more complex landscape that, frankly, the United States is not ready to deal with. And it starts with this kind of amps up with the Suez Crisis. So Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of Egypt's military government, had himself attended the Bandung Conference. They characterized him as charismatic. He was also an Arab nationalist, which meant that he wanted to make sure that the Arab nations had control over themselves. And he left the conference determined to not only chart an independent course for his nation, but also to get rid of any European colonialism left over in the Middle East, which the Europeans had colonized post-World War I, where they took all that land from the Ottoman Empire and split it up between the French and the English. He embraced non-alignment pretty extremely, and he was really looking to play the superpowers against each other. So instead of not interacting with either side, what he was looking to do instead was interact with both sides for his benefit. And so the first thing that he really did is he sought economic aid for the development of the Aswan High Dam from the United States. The Aswan High Dam is going to be a hydroelectric dam on the Nile. And from the Soviets, he sought weapons and manufactured goods. So he's trying to get a little bit from both, right? But one of the key components of Nasser's Arab nationalism was to nationalize the Suez Canal, essentially make the Suez Canal owned by the Egyptian government. Right? This is an incredibly vital man-made waterway that linked the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. So basically linked Europe to the Indian Ocean much quicker. However, this was operated and owned by Britain and France. They had France had started kind of putting it together, and Britain took it over later. And this occurred on July 26, 1956, less than a week after Americans had broken off those foreign aid talks for the Aswan Dam. And the idea here, the calculation Nasser made is that this is supposed to really put a negative profile on the British and the French, right, to kind of rebuke them, and then also at the same time to pressure the United States to fund the Aswan Dam. Now, with the nationalization of the Suez Canal, Eisenhower, where the U.S. had no real play in the nationalization of the Suez Canal, he urges a lot of caution. However, Britain and France and their new ally in the Middle East, Israel, ignored the U.S. and launched an invasion of the Suez Canal in late October of 1956, which was just weeks before the U.S. presidential election. So maybe that's why Eisenhower actually urged caution, because he didn't want to rock the boat right before the election. Maybe he would have been more assertive if it was after the election. Who knows? But Eisenhower viewed the British-led attack as a betrayal of the relationship between the English-speaking allies, especially because the British Prime Minister at the time, Anthony Eden, deliberately hid the attack from Eisenhower's administration, and on top of that, it was disrespectful of American leadership during the Cold War. To add to this ill-timed invasion and attack took international attention away from another event that was happening that we'll cover later, the Soviets suppressing a popular uprising in Hungary, led by Imre Nagy. And so the United States and the Soviet Union both condemned the Suez invasion. So this is kind of one of the first times we see joint agreement on something here. And in fact, Eisenhower then pressures his allies, Britain and France, to halt the invasion, to withdraw their troops. And he also wanted a UN peacekeeping force to monitor the ceasefire and return the canal to Egypt. So in less than a month, so by November of 1956, the Suez Crisis was over, and it had really changed the relationship in the Western alliance. The U.S. completely is in charge at this point, delivering a massive blow to Britain's international standing, and really, really speeds up the pace of decolonization. Not every country's decolonized yet, not even close, but this really starts to speed that up, and it also, again, asserted American dominance over their alliance. And the Suez Crisis also cemented this relationship between U.S., Britain, and France, as the U.S. on top, Britain and France as kind of supporters, right, junior partners, as it says here. It also sees increased involvement in Middle Eastern affairs for the United States, mostly because of the oil deposits in the area, right? Those oil deposits are incredibly important strategically. And so by thwarting the invasion of Egypt, Eisenhower wasn't sympathizing with Nasser or Arab nationalism. He was simply just doing, he thought it was too bad of a look to try to do for the British and the French, right? And kind of in reaction to this, he announces the Eisenhower Doctrine, where he basically extends the Truman Doctrine, idea of containment, to the Middle East, right? So applies Truman's containment to the Middle East. And in 1958, as an example of this, the U.S. Marines landed in Lebanon to prevent the toppling of a pro-American government. So what we see is the Soviets are looking to build and strengthen ties with Arab nations, Arab Muslim nations, especially. The U.S. actually gets closer to Israel in the Middle East, which they viewed as a key ally in the region to help stop the spread of communism. But that's going to do it for this section. In the next section, we'll start talking about the Khrushchev era. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you.